Greetings, Father Mark. Signing on, continuing the course on the early modern papacy. Picking up, well, we didn't finish with Pope Paul IV last time, Pope 223. So we'll pick up with that. Let's see. I think the last thing we were covering his background relationships with Saint Catherine of Genoa, Saint Gaetano, and Saint Jerome Emiliani. So to conclude that, Saint Jerome Emiliani was canonized in 1767, patron saint of orphans and abandoned children. Saint Gaetano was canonized in 1671, patron saint of the unemployed and of the nation of Argentina. Meanwhile, Carafa, who's going to become the Pope, Gian Pietro Carafa, he was appointed Archbishop of Naples in February of 1549, 2 years after St. Gaetano died in that city of Naples. Then 4 years later, in 1553, Gian Pietro Carafa became Dean of the College of Cardinals, in which capacity he attended the Second Conclave of 1555 and accepted election as Pope 223 on the 23rd of May, 1555. He took the papal name Paul IV and reigned for 4 years and 3 months. Many assumed that Paul's zeal for reform and asceticism, scholasticism, devotionalism meant that he would immediately reconvene the Council of Trent, suspended on since April 28, 1552, during the reign of two popes before Julius III. Because it was suspended because of the 8th Habsburg-Valois War, which we already covered. Everyone, Catholic and Protestant alike, were stunned to learn that Pope Paul IV would not even consider reconvening the Council of Trent. This was not because he was ignoring reform. Rather, it was because his own experience of the council, the first period of the council, had exasperated him too much to want to repeat it. He agreed with all of the final decisions made at Trent up to that point: justification, baptism, confirmation, etc. But he could not. He couldn't stand. He couldn't bear or endure the endless speeches and debates of long-winded prelates, which only resulted in decisions that were obvious to him from the beginning. So his solution as Pope was to just skip all of the pointless vocalization and simply implement the needed reforms by papal edict. Now he was, of course, entirely within his rights to do that. However, the political realities in the age of monarchies meant that reforms in the church would only be implemented in territories of sovereigns who agreed with those reforms. Remember, monarchies are not free societies. We take a lot for granted as Americans, but, if the king didn't want it, then it wasn't going to happen. Without the participation of their own clergy in those decisions, none of the monarchs would cooperate with Paul. Nevertheless, this is what he chose to do. He appointed a commission of 60 trusted cardinals and prelates, and based on their recommendations, and they were, of course, were just recommending what they knew he wanted them to recommend. He created the Index of Forbidden Books in 1557. He commanded a revision of the Roman Missal and the Breviary. He forbade the presentation of monasteries to secular clerics as a benefice, and conversely, he forbade the presentation of a secular benefice, cura animorum, with care of souls, to anyone other than a secular cleric. Now, these were, as we've seen since the medieval course, perennial banes, perennial problems of feudalism that plagued the church. So, I mean, further, he decreed that any cleric outside of his own territory must have written permission of their superior to be out of the territory. And without that, they were to be arrested by the local Inquisition and investigated. And if it was discovered that they did not have such permission, like maybe it's possible that somebody would have had the permission, but they got robbed along the way and the bag that it was in was stolen. So, but if it turned out that they never did have the permission, then they were to be punished. And punishments could range from a simple penance of fasting to corporal punishment, like flogging or being put in the stocks, or a pilgrimage. You have to walk to Compostela because of this. So this is the remote origin of the celebret, as they used to call it. That's now superfluous, but as recently as when I was ordained, it was a card that you would get, like if you would be traveling outside of your diocese or out of the country, you get the card from your bishop indicating that you were in good standing, so that you still had faculties to celebrate Mass, do sacraments in another place. Now, even that's superfluous, because the celebret would last for a year, but now, for a number of reasons, which I'm sure you don't need me to explain, it's much more complex. Anyway, further, Pope Paul IV appointed Michele Ghisleri as head of the Roman Inquisition. And this guy is going to be the future Pope, Pius V. Pope Paul IV prohibited all begging in the papal state. No one could beg. He fired Michelangelo, the artist Michelangelo, and he ordered other artists to cover shall we say, the reproductive areas of Michelangelo's nude paintings in the Sistine Chapel. All books written by Protestants were outlawed. Well, that's what he wanted to do: outlaw them in Catholic lands, together with Italian or German translations of the Latin Bible. So that the only Bible is the Latin Vulgate. So if you can't read Latin, then you just can't read the Bible. That was his view. Paul's authoritarian tendencies and his own temperamental lack of patience forfeited much of the support on which he might have relied, and it delayed even longer the reform work of the Council of Trent. Even though Trent ended up doing some of this anyway, I mean, the Index of Forbidden Books, the benefice problem, Trent ended up addressing that. Okay, as we've seen, no pope, since the pope was also the monarch of the papal state. No pope could afford to ignore political realities in Italy, particularly who was going to control the papal state as a diagonal slice of land from coast to coast in Italy and around the middle of Italy. So whoever controlled the territory to the north, it's Tuscany and Lombardy, or the territory to the south, it's Naples. It mattered. It could affect the papal state. So Paul even though it certainly would not be his preference, he was drawn into this. Also, remember from the part A of this, which we had to interrupt for reasons I won't burden you with, Paul detested Spain and the Spanish. It was in part it was ethnic hatred, but there was also nationalist hatred in that Spain was in this period and for the previous century. This was Spain's time in history. It was their, when they built an empire. It was this wealthy, powerful nation, and they were expanding and establishing colonies in the New World. Well, they also had colonies in Europe, and one of them was Naples, which is where Paul IV, when he was born, Gian Pietro Carafa, he was from the territory of Naples, and as we saw last time, he regarded with repugnance the Spanish imperialist colonial view that they had a right to control Naples. So, as Pope, Paul IV, he made an ill-considered alliance against Spain, an alliance with King Henri II of France, to join a French army and a papal army together to drive the Spanish out of Naples. This precipitated a war, of course, that lasted for years and inflicted much suffering, as always, on the innocents who were just caught in between, and whose fields were trampled by the infantry and cavalry of the opposing armies marching back and forth. This conflict culminated with an invasion of the Papal States. Spain also had the best army. I mean, not only was it their time in terms of imperialism and the extent of their empire, but there's a reason that they got this, because they had the best army. So the Franco-Papal alliance was defeated on the field, and then Spain retaliated. They sent an army of 12,000 troops to invade the Papal State, beginning in September of 1556. The French forces of Henri II were approaching from the north to reinforce Pope Paul, but the Spanish intercepted them, defeated them, and forced them to withdraw at the Battle of Civitella in August of the next year, 1557. So that left Paul to face the Spanish army alone. And whatever virtues Paul did have, he certainly did have virtues. But being a general was not one of them. And he did have many supporters, sincere supporters, but none of them were talented generals either. Whereas the Spanish troops were led by the Duke of Alba, who was one of the, lived for a very long time. He lived lived to be 80. Alba was his title. He was the third Duke of Alba, A-L-B-A. His actual name was Fernando Alvarez de Toledo y Pimentel. He proved to be one of the great captains, one of the great generals of the generation. So he easily crushed the papal army and occupied the Papal State. Now, Pope Paul was fortunate that Spain at the time was such a deeply Catholic country, and the Duke of Alba was too. So, I mean, they did have their political ambitions, the imperialism and all, but the Papal State and the Holy See was completely at their mercy. And while they were angry, they would not completely destroy the church over it. So they granted Paul a very generous peace, very generous terms, in 1557, which in effect pretended that the episode never happened. So, rewinding to 1555, the year that Carafa was elected Pope Paul IV, we arrive at a crossroads of several continuities that we've been following First road is, or one road, I won't say first because all the stuff was happening at the same time, so I'll just say one of the roads of continuity was the legal settlement of the Protestant movement in Germany. That was the Peace of Augsburg. A second road of continuity is England. The English Reformation, the English Protestant movement, was reversed when England formally reunited with Rome under Queen Mary I. A third road of continuity is the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, began the process of dividing his empire, the Habsburg and Trastamara Empire, in order to retire from public life. And fourth, the Calvinist version of the Protestant movement came to Scotland when John Knox returned to Scotland after spending time exiled in Geneva with John Calvin. So we'll start with him. John Knox, that's Knox. He is the founder of Scottish Presbyterianism, which is Calvinist. He was born a Catholic in East Lothian, Scotland. His father, William, was a merchant. His mother died when he was a child. His older brother, according to the customs of the day with which we are familiar, was designated to inherit the family business. So John's father just decided to send John into the church in the characteristic malfunction of feudalism. Family arranging these things, not just, the church, but arranging the sacraments of vocation, both marriage and holy orders, without regard to someone's vocation. John Knox received his education at church expense at the University of St. Andrews. There he was exposed to the same rift between scholastics and humanists that we've seen in the lives of other proto-Protestants. And like them, Calvin and Luther, and he came to detest scholasticism. In the case of John Knox, his exposure to this conflict occurred in the 1530s, when events to his south, in England, brought that land out of the church, based on ecclesial nationalism, with the monarch as the head of the church in the realm. This was written into the law of England by means of the First Act of Supremacy, passed on November 3rd, 1534, which we covered previously. John Knox was ordained a priest in Edinburgh on Holy Saturday, the following year, 1536. So Father John Knox worked as an ecclesiastical notary and supplemented his income by tutoring the sons of wealthy Scottish lairds. Instead of lords, the Scots called them lairds, Lairds. The protest movement became real for John Knox and for others in Scottish academia 2 years later in 1538. George Wishart, that's Wishart, a fellow Scot, an alumnus of a different university, University of Aberdeen, preached and published his view, and the general protest movement view, that devotion to the Blessed Mother was pagan idolatry. So Wishart was arrested and publicly recanted his statements in order to escape incineration as a heretic. He was released, and he then fled, went to England, which had already been taken out of communion with the church by Henry VIII 4 years earlier. So Wishart was able to find employment at Cambridge University, where he spent the next 8 years writing and translating information from the continental protest movement in Germany and Switzerland and smuggling them back into Scotland, where they were avidly read by Catholics like John Knox, who hated Catholicism, and priests like Father John Knox, who hated the priesthood, yet still parasited off the church to make a living. In 1554, Wishart returned to Scotland in what he thought was triumph. As a Cambridge scholar of Scottish extraction, he was invited to join a delegation sent by Henry VIII, King of England, to Scotland, exploring the possibility of a marriage alliance using his own son, the future King Edward VI, to wed. The proposal was that he would wed the 2-year-old Mary, officially Queen of Scotland, since her father's death on December 14th, 1542. Obviously, they wouldn't have married. I mean, they would have, had to wait till the girl got a little older. But still, I mean, this is a characteristic, problem, the feudalism. I mean, this isn't the reason to. I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's what they did. Now, so why would Henry do this? Well, remember, Henry's father engineered an Anglo-Spanish alliance between England and Spain, which, of course, was ruined by Henry VIII himself by setting aside his Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon. So he, this kind of left him swinging. And he wanted an ally. And Scotland is, contiguous, is to the north. And Scotland was a longtime ally of France. And the child, Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, as we covered previously, she was related to Henry. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the granddaughter of Henry's sister, Margaret. And she was the daughter of the French aristocrat Marie de Guise. Marriage negotiations collapsed, more for nationalist reasons rather than religious, as Scotland, or at least, there were some who did, but there were enough at the time to torpedo these negotiations, enough among the Scottish lairds who did not want to be reduced to be a province of England, which is what where they feared that marriage would go. So after this failure, then Wishart became vulnerable. He was arrested in Scotland as a relapsed heretic for publishing anti-Catholic writings after his earlier recantation of those same views. Wishart was executed by hanging, and then his corpse was incinerated for heresy on March 1st, 1546. In retrospect, we can see that this triggered a cycle of feuding and vendetta that shaped history for the next 2 generations, at least. Father John Knox had been an avid reader of Wishart's smuggled protest writings and eagerly went to meet him when the marriage diplomatic expedition arrived. He actually stayed with Wishart and absorbed all the news about the protest movement on the continent. And John Knox was present on the night that Wishart was arrested. Now, Knox was among those who escaped capture, but he internalized a lifelong grudge against the church for what he regarded as the unjust murder of Wishart. But at the moment, they were all fugitives. As was the case with every single other country in which the protest movement emerged, the population was atomized into multiple factions. One faction were those who wished to remain theologically Catholic and ecclesially Catholic, meaning in union with Rome. Just stay the way they were. Second were those who wished to remain theologically Catholic, but with national control of the church apart from Rome. Now that's what Henry VIII wanted. He didn't really want to change Catholic doctrine apart from the role of the papacy. Third, those who wished an entirely new theological orientation, either Lutheran or Calvinist, and all of those favored a national church. Obviously, I mean, you could not advocate for a completely new theology and expect to remain in union with Rome. So this third category of people were those who wanted a new theology, and obviously as a corollary apart from Rome. Fourth, those of all the previous factions who had political agendas of either the nationalist variety or the internationalist variety through alliance with some other nation. So that actually triples the number of factions. The trial and execution of George Wishart was presided over by the Archbishop of St. Andrews, who happened to also be the papal legate, and the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, Cardinal David Beaton, Beaton. Theologically, he was Catholic, and ecclesially, he was pro-papal. So he just wanted to continue things the way they had been throughout the whole Middle Ages. Politically, he was a Scottish nationalist. So he favored the Franco-Scottish alliance, the alliance between France and Scotland, as better able to perpetuate Scottish independence than would the Anglo-Scottish alliance, proposed by Henry VIII and defended by Wishart. With this ecclesial and political alignment, Cardinal Beaton automatically had myriad enemies from the other factions. The execution of Wishart, presided over by Beaton, representing the Pope, even though the Pope didn't know anything about this. Nevertheless, Beaton was the papal legate, so the Pope gets blamed for it. And although I should say, if the Pope did know anything about it, he would not have blinked, at incinerating Wishart as a relapsed heretic. Now, I'm not defending. I'm just that's just the way things were done then. So the execution of Wishart, presided over by Beaton as papal legate and as a pro-French Scottish Lord Chancellor, solidified action against him. On the 29th of May, 1546, a 5-man hit team ambushed the gate guards of St. Andrew's Castle, and penetrated the castle where Beaton lived, murdered Beaton, mutilated his corpse, and dangled it out of the upper window. As it turned out, Beaton was the last Catholic cardinal of Scotland, prior to the protest movement gaining ascendancy over the country. And he was the last Scottish cardinal to the 20th century. I think it was John Paul II. It was that late before another Scottish cardinal could be appointed. The assassins, then, took control of Beaton's castle, St. Andrews. It wasn't his person. It was the castle of the Archbishop of, St. Andrews. So they took control of the episcopal residence, converting it into a mustering point for the anti-Catholic factions. John Knox joined them at the castle on April 10th, 1547. He was elected preacher, following Calvinist congregational ecclesiology. Though at this period, the content of his preaching was Lutheran, Scripture alone, justification by faith alone, along with the standard protest tropes of the Pope as the Antichrist, repudiation of the Catholic Mass, prayers for the dead, belief in purgatory, praying to Our Lady as idolatry, all the standard Protestant tropes. While the murderers of Cardinal Beaton did have personal reasons for their vendetta, their actions also served the purposes of Henry VIII, whether they realized it or not. His purpose being to absorb Scotland into England. So, Henry provided material and financial support to the assassins and to the rebels who joined them at St. Andrew's Castle, and this triggered a civil war in Scotland. As civil war happened everywhere, the protest movement emerged. At the same time, Cardinal Beaton's faction wanted revenge for his murder. They still wanted Scotland to remain Catholic, remain in union with Rome, remain independent, and allied with the French against the English, allied with Catholic France against Protestant England. All of the factions understood that having physical custody of the child queen, Mary, Queen of Scots, was essential to their future plan. Now, Mary's father, King James V of Scotland, was dead. He died, shortly after her birth, which is why she's a child queen. But her mother was still alive. Her mother was a French aristocrat, Marie de Guise. That's Marie, M-A-R-I-E, then the particle of nobility, the D-E, and Guise, G-U-I-S-E. She had physical custody of Mary, of her child. After Cardinal Beaton's murder, Marie de Guise prevailed on her cousin, the King Henri II of France. And remember, we attended his wedding when he married Catherine de Medici. So Marie de Guise appealed to him to supply her with ships and troops, which he did at this initially, and she knew how to use them, and so but she startled everyone. Certainly startled the Scots rebels with her tactical initiative. She used what she was given to attack the rebels at the castle of St. Andrews, capture them, executed some, and chained others as galley slaves. One of those captured and reduced to being a slave rower on a French galley was John Knox, giving him yet another reason for implacable hatred of Catholics. In June of 1548, in the context of the Civil War in Scotland, which was really an Anglo-Scottish war, but anyway, in June of 48, the Anglo-Scottish Protestant Alliance, their side of the Civil War, captured Haddington, Scotland, and devastated the surrounding countryside. Marie de Guise, once more achieving surprise by means of tactical initiative, counterattacked and drove them out and occupied Haddington. The next month, on July 7th, 1548, Marie de Guise summoned a Scottish parliament to meet at Haddington, on the field of victory, so to speak. And it consisted of her Franco-Scottish Catholic supporters to meet. And they actually met in a convent in the liberated town. There they agreed to Marie's proposal that her daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, would marry the heir to the French throne, who was also a child, but he would be the future King Francis II, son of the reigning King Henri II and the Italian Catherine de Medici. The bride, Mary, Queen of Scots, was age 6, so she was sent to France to be educated until she was old enough to marry. Turns out she spent the next 13 years in Catholic France, while her mother, Marie de Guise, served as regent in Scotland, engaged in endless, draining warfare against the Scottish Protestants and their English allies. In February of 1549, only 1 year after the Franco-Scottish marriage alliance, the French king, Henri II, betrayed his cousin, Marie de Guise, by negotiating a settlement with the Regency Council of England, of the English king, Edward VI, who, of course, was also a child at this time, negotiated a settlement to end hostilities in the Scottish theater of operations. Henri of France did this because he needed those resources to pursue his pointless colonial war in Italy against Charles V. And that is the 8th Habsburg-Valois War, which we have alluded to several times. Marie de Guise was furious about this, and she only learned about it after it was finalized. She correctly deduced the long-term result would doom Scotland to more religious wars and ultimately to leaving the Catholic Church. What she did not foresee and could not have foreseen, or could not have allowed herself to see, was that after her own death, it also doomed her daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, to a lengthy imprisonment and ultimately execution by beheading. At the time, however, Marie de Guise was Queen Regent of Scotland for her daughter. The Scottish lairds despised her as a foreigner and believed they had little to fear, with Henri II preoccupied with his war against the Habsburgs. More than once, Marie de Guise proved them wrong by defeating them in battle, but in the absence of genuine, substantial military support from France, her limited resources limited her to tactical victories only, never the strategic solution that she sought. One of the reasons that Marie's prediction came true, that Scotland would be doomed to eventually leave the church, was that the 1549 armistice stipulated freeing prisoners of war, including John Knox, still chained to an oar on a French galley after nearly 2 years. Knox was freed in England, that's by the terms of the armistice, so he remained there for a time, receiving a license to preach in the Church of England, which of course was Protestant, on April 7th, 1549. He obtained a position at the Stollen Church, was formerly Catholic, stolen by Henry VIII, St. Nicholas Church, in Newcastle upon Tyne, Tyne. There he met and married a fellow Scottish Protestant refugee, Marjorie Bowes, Bowes. John Knox remained in England until King Edward VI died. He fled England during the reign of Queen Mary I. Now this is Mary Tudor, Mary of England, not Mary Queen of Scots. Finding work in Germany and then ultimately in Geneva with John Calvin. Knox returned to Scotland in 1555 after an 8-year absence. Marie de Guise was still alive and still fighting against all odds, hopeless odds, to keep the Protestants from solidifying control of Scotland. So John Knox would have to wait another 5 years until after her death to achieve his revenge. But he did. In the same year as his return, 1555, the first year of the reign of Pope Paul IV, so we're rewinding again, the protest movement in Germany reached a historic turning point. Specifically, the Peace of Augsburg, Augsburg. Augsburg's a city in Germany. That's where this took place. And the peace is dated September 25th, 1555. Negotiations between Catholics and Lutherans in Germany began in Augsburg during the reign of Pope Julius III. It was obvious to most rational minds that the divisions between Catholics and Lutherans in Germany would not be healed. Ever. That the two, they had just become ontologically different. Just the view of grace, the view of the sacraments, the view of the church, it was just too different, that there was no way to reconcile. So all that remained was to find a solution in which they could coexist to halt the endless rounds of bloodshed between them. To this end, Pope Julius III had dispatched a seasoned diplomat, Cardinal Giovanni Moroni, Morone. He was a Milanese aristocrat by birth, and obviously a member of the College of Cardinals. So Julius dispatched him to represent the Holy See in the negotiations. The basis for discussion was the Augsburg Interim of 1548, which we covered previously. By 1555, when the new negotiations at Augsburg took place, the Holy Roman Emperor was still Charles V. He was only 55 years old. Now, lifespans were different, so that was, in the 16th century, that was on the older side. But, there were people who lived longer than that. Yet, he had been Holy Roman Emperor since the age of 19, and each year had been filled with warfare, scheming, betrayals, more failures than successes, as he would have admitted by the end of his life, in dealing with Protestants, dealing with rebellious German sovereignties, dealing with the implacable hostility of France, dealing with problems in the New World, the colonial problems, dealing with England, dealing with conflicts with popes. Now, he was far from perfect. He made many mistakes, which he deeply regretted, most notably the sack of Rome in 1527. But few men in history could have taken on his burdens at the time in history when he did and done better. It really would have taken a Julius Caesar, an Alexander the Great, or someone to have done better. Although, I don't know, who knows? They certainly would have done differently, and they would have been more successful on the battlefield than he was. But whether, they would have done better in the long term, who knows? By 1555, he was tired of fighting. He felt much older than he was, and he had lost hope. When the Protestants in Germany formed yet another alliance with Catholic France against him, while he was fighting the French in Italy, he finally gave up. That was just the last straw. He agreed to a treaty, essentially a treaty. The Peace of Augsburg is essentially a treaty between him and all the states in Germany, the Catholic and Protestant states in Germany. It consisted of 22 articles signed by the Catholic and Lutheran sovereigns in Germany on September 25th, 1555. Now, we won't go through all 22 articles, but we'll summarize in 5 points. The Peace of Augsburg decreed, first, the existing territorial divisions in Germany between Catholic and Lutheran would be recognized as permanent, with no demands for restitution of stolen property, no demands for compensation for vandalized and destroyed property that took place before the date of the treaty. Second, no additional changes by force would be permitted from either side. Third, henceforward, the religion of the ruler of a territory would be the state religion of that territory. If his religion changed, then the state religion would change. So this is expressed in the phrase you may have encountered in other world history courses, the cuius regio eius religio, in ecclesiastical Latin. That means it sounds awkward in English. It's probably why they leave it in the Latin. It translates literally as whose realm their religion. Fourth, no sovereign was allowed to claim the right of protecting citizens in any other sovereignty on the basis of religion. And fifth, the only two religious confessions permitted in Germany were Catholic and Lutheran. The Calvinists had refused to participate in the negotiations. The Peace of Augsburg was unavoidable by 1555. All sides wanted it. It wasn't the ideal, but they all accepted that there was really no other solution. The papal legate to Augsburg, Cardinal Giovanni Moroni, accepted it because he was a pragmatist and he had to. It was not the ideal, but his hope was that it would at least end the warfare, and perhaps after years of peace, tempers would cool, and then calm and patient diplomacy could begin to make improvements. That strategy of slowly but unwaveringly pursuing correct principles has been the most successful in church history, because the church can think in terms of centuries. Now, however, that requires patience, and Pope Paul IV was not a patient man. He was enraged. He went ballistic when Moroni reported the results. And he was so mad, Pope Paul was so mad, that he had Moroni arrested and placed on trial before the Inquisition on suspicion of heresy and schism. Now, the item that set him off like that was that Moroni had agreed in his name, in the Pope's name, to waiving any restitution of stolen property from the church, and waiving any claims, to legally pursue justice, for those who were murdered during the war. Now, the inquisitors were put in an awkward position. I mean, they knew Moroni was not a heretic, and certainly not a schismatic. Yet they were so afraid of Pope Paul IV that they did not dare to formally acquit him. So Moroni stayed in prison for 4 years, unconvicted. But one day he would be vindicated, and ultimately it's this guy who would save the Council of Trent and bring it to a successful completion. But that's in a future reign. So rewinding back to 1555, the first year of Pope Paul IV, we go to England. The situation in England appeared hopeful at the commencement of Paul IV's reign in 1555. Only 2 years after the coronation of the devout Catholic Queen Mary I, granddaughter of the great Queen Isabel of Spain. The country, England, returned to union with Rome and under Mary, and the Synod of London, presided over by Cardinal Reginald Pole as legate to Pope Julius III, instituted many reforms that would later become standard practice after the Council of Trent. Because remember, Cardinal Pole was one of the presiders over the first period of Trent, so he was very involved. However, Pope Paul IV was not happy with the settlement, for the same reason that he was mad at Moroni over the Peace of Augsburg. He was angry with what he saw as the compromise with criminals made, with murderers and thieves, made by Cardinal Pole and Queen Mary regarding the patrimony of the church. Like the Peace of Augsburg in Germany, the Synod of London in 1555 did not demand the return of stolen church property, or restitution or compensation for destroyed or vandalized church property, nor did it demand prosecution of those responsible for murder of thousands of Catholics during the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI. And again, like Moroni in Germany, neither Queen Mary nor Cardinal Pole were happy with this, but they felt it was better to achieve peace and end to the violence rather than perpetuate it by making demands that could never be met. Like if Mary had actually tried to do that, it would have triggered another civil war. There were just too many that had benefited during the reigns of Henry and Edward by theft from the church. Because Henry had created many new members of the nobility, the peerage, from stolen church property. And all those people, they weren't going to give that up. And now they were in the second generation since that. Pope Paul IV fired Cardinal Pole from his position as papal legate, commanded him to return to Rome to appear before the Inquisition. No doubt he would have been imprisoned along with Cardinal Moroni, but death saved him. Both Queen Mary and Cardinal Pole died in an influenza epidemic in England on the same day, just a few hours apart, on November 17th, 1558. The throne of England then went to Elizabeth I of the House of Tudor. As it turns out, she was the last member of the House of Tudor to reign. We have alluded to her before. We haven't really talked about her life, but she was born. Gotta answer this. Okay, sorry about that. Elizabeth I of England. She she was born in Greenwich Palace on September 7th, 1533. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and wife number 2, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was aged 2 years and 8 months when her mother was beheaded by order of her father on May 19th, 1536, at which point Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and deprived of her place in the royal succession. 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour, wife number 3, who died shortly after the birth of their son, who became King Edward VI. She died, and he was born in 1537. Elizabeth spent the rest of Henry's reign quietly studying under tutors who all noted her natural intellect, especially her facility for learning languages, both ancient and modern. Religiously, her early years were, according to Henry's version of the Church of England, as theologically Catholic in all ways except with himself as its head instead of the Pope. When Elizabeth was age 14, in 1547, Henry died, and her half-brother, King Edward VI, became king. As covered previously, England was ruled by a regency council during Edward's reign, which brought England farther in the Calvinist direction of the protest movement, and the English Calvinists or the Puritans, as in American, which we will cover in the fourth-year course, the American History course. It was this regency council that negotiated a settlement with France that included freedom for prisoners of war, liberating John Knox from being a galley slave, and opening to him employment as a preacher in the Church of England. See, it's all connected. All of the webs, it's all connected. Edward VI died on Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at the age of 15. As previously seen, his will ignored the Succession to the Crown Act of 1543 by excluding both Elizabeth and her elder half-sister Mary from the succession, and instead declared as his heir Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary. Jane was proclaimed queen by the Privy Council, as we saw, but her support quickly crumbled, and she was deposed after 9 days. On August 3rd, 1553, Queen Mary of England rode triumphantly into London with Elizabeth at her side. Elizabeth was a survivor. At that point, many Protestants fled England for the continent. John Knox was among them, settling in Geneva, offered sanctuary and employment by John Calvin. On November 6th of 1558, Mary recognized Elizabeth as her heir. As we saw, Mary had a pregnancy, but the child was stillborn. And then Mary died on November 17th, 1558. Then Elizabeth succeeded to the throne. Technically, England was in communion with Rome still, because, when Mary died and Elizabeth became queen. Now, Elizabeth's life of danger and uncertainty left her with the pragmatism of a survivor. Keeping her options open, she went out of her way to find a bishop to crown her who had been a Catholic bishop favored by Queen Mary because he had been exiled for refusing to sign the Act of Supremacy. So he ran away. Like, he would have been murdered with Bishop John Fisher, but he ran away. And then came back when Mary became queen. So this is Owen Oglethorpe. He was the Catholic Bishop of Carlisle. He presided at the coronation at Westminster Abbey on January 15th, 1559. Since the Bishop of Carlisle was far down, the food chain, so to speak, this was deliberate, that she chose him. It had to be because of his holy orders were unimpeachable from the Catholic perspective. This suggests the possibility that Elizabeth would have been open to, or at least was keeping that option open in 58, of maintaining in some form Mary's reconciliation with Rome. Now, what might have been will never be known, because Pope Paul IV flatly refused to recognize Elizabeth's sovereignty on the grounds of her illegitimate birth. Ecclesial nationalism was therefore the necessary position for the new queen. Her life history left her mistrustful of Calvinist extremism, as well as Catholic orthodoxy that regarded her as permanently tainted by the circumstances of her birth. The primary goal of her religious policy, well, all of her policy, was national stability and personal survival. Elizabeth's first parliament opened in January of 1559, became immediately distracted by disputes among Protestants, between moderate Protestants who preferred Henry's version, who preferred a national church with a hierarchy, Catholic hierarchy, not Catholic, but with bishops and priests, as opposed to Calvinists, who did not. So in April of 1559, after 3 months, 4 months of arguing about this, Elizabeth's Privy Council proposed, they separated the agenda into two separate bills, one concerning royal supremacy, the other concerning the liturgy. As the Pope refused to recognize Elizabeth as rightful sovereign, papal jurisdiction in England that had been restored by Mary was once more abolished in April of 59. Elizabeth let it be known that she would accept the title Supreme Governor of the Church of England, rather than Supreme Head of the Church of England. By this, she hoped to send a message of moderation and stability, because Calvinists, as well as Catholics, had theological objections to Henry VIII's title of Supreme Head of the Church. Calvinists regarded Christ as the only head of the Church, based on St. Paul's letters, while Catholics looked to the Pope as the vicar of Christ. I mean, of course, Christ is the head of the Church, but Catholics looked to the Pope as the vicar of Christ, meaning the successor of St. Peter. Yet, while Elizabeth was willing to moderate in policy and compromise in some way, many ways, she would not equivocate on recognition of her authority. She still insisted that all clergy and all office holders swear to accept in an oath of supremacy. She was willing to accept the title Supreme Governor instead of Supreme Head, but they still all had to swear to recognize her as that she was Supreme Governor of the Church. So on that basis, the Act of Supremacy easily passed in April of 1559. The second bill proposed by Elizabeth's Privy Council was another act of uniformity, designed to set the contentious issues of liturgical practice and wording of public prayers. Now, I know as Americans, the Parliament, which is their version of Congress, debating religious policy, it just doesn't compute. Well, in our system it doesn't, but in their system it did, because this is the state church, the established church, which of course we have no established church in our country, but they did then. The Act of Uniformity of 59 required church attendance on Sundays and holy days, and imposed a fine for each day absent. It restored Thomas Cranmer's 1552 Book of Common Prayer with some modifications designed to neutralize objections. It removed, for example, the 1552 book's condemnation of, quote, the Bishop of Rome and all his detestable enormities, unquote. It just removed that. Now, it did not replace it with praise of the Pope. It was just silent on that. It just removed it and was just silent. Further, the revisions, the 59 revisions to the 52 Book of Common Prayer, stipulated the existence of a church hierarchy. There would be bishops and priests. They would wear vestments when presiding at Anglican services. Further, it rewrote the 52 words, the 1552 Book of Common Prayer's words, at the communion service to read, quote, the body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving." End quote. This masterpiece of ambiguity was typical of Elizabeth's pragmatism. It did not require acceptance or rejection of the real presence in the Eucharist. Those who wished to believe it could interpret these words as permitting it, while those, like the Calvinists, who preferred a symbolic view of the Eucharist, of the communion service, could also accept that wording, because there was nothing in that wording that contradicted that either. Elizabeth would make further adjustments to shape Anglicanism, but those took place in a future papal reign. So if we have time, we'll talk about those in due course. The significance being that, that the 13 colonies, which became the United States, were English colonies. So that it does affect us. It affected our history. Okay, so Elizabeth. Now, rewinding again back to 1555, we catch up with Charles V. After signing the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V began dividing his sprawling empire, establishing an international reset that affected both secular and church history for centuries, literally for centuries. Now remember, Charles V, he was the son. On his father's side, his father was Philip II von Habsburg, who was the son of a Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I. His mother was Juana of the House of Trastamara. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. So Charles inherited from both. So from the Habsburgs, from his Habsburg father, Charles inherited Austria, the Netherlands, and the Duchy of Milan. He bequeathed those, he divided his empire, and he took that as a set and bequeathed those to his brother, his younger brother, Ferdinand I, in 1555, meaning that he was pointing to Ferdinand as the presumptive candidate to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. That position was elective. We talked about that, so I won't repeat that. Was elected, and Ferdinand was duly elected on August 27th, 1556, as Holy Roman Emperor. From his mother's side, from the Trastamara holdings, and in that capacity, he was King Carlos I of Spain. He inherited the crown of Aragon, which included Catalonia and Valencia on the Iberian Peninsula, as well as the Mediterranean colonies of Naples, which set off Pope Paul IV so badly, the island of Sicily, and the island of Sardinia. Also from his mother, as Carlos I of Spain, he inherited the crown of Castile, which included the Spanish colonies in the Americas, as it was Charles's grandmother Isabel, in her capacity as Queen of Castile, who sponsored the voyages of Columbus. So as King Carlos I of Spain, Charles abdicated both crowns of Aragon and Castile, along with all their respective holdings. He abdicated in favor of his only son, Felipe II in Spanish history, of Philip II. Charles's wife, meaning the mother of this guy, Philip II, was another Isabel. She was of the House of Avis, daughter of King Manuel I of Portugal. So that gave Philip a claim through her to Portugal. In 1580, Philip II exercised this claim. He pressed that claim, which the Portuguese did not welcome, so it meant a war between Spain and Portugal. It was a hideous, very, very destructive war for both sides. But he won. Spain won. And so with this victory, Philip reigned over the entire Iberian Peninsula. And that remained until, after his death. He died in 1598, but the unification lasted until 1640. Now, all these are Catholic countries, and one of the titles involved was Holy Roman Emperor. So the Pope, Paul IV, should have been involved in all of this, but he wasn't. His personality had alienated even many loyal Catholics. So he was not only left out of the decision-making, but he was not even officially informed. He only learned about it when bishops, who lived in those territories, wrote to him. And they all assumed that he knew already. They were wondering why he hadn't told them. But anyway, that's how he found out. So he was mad, again, and he refused to recognize any of those changes made. But no one even bothered to be offended by that. Paul had relegated himself and the Holy See to obscurity in international politics, just by his personality. I mean, it really, that may seem shallow and trivial, but they just didn't like him. After divesting himself of his empire and shaping Western history for the next few centuries, Charles retired to a monastery, the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura, in September of 1558. This monastery was founded by the Hieronymites in 1402. It was located in a village which gave it the name, the village of San Yuste, in the province of Caceres in Extremadura, Spain. That's in the central western Spain on the border with Portugal. The Philip to whom Charles left Spain and all of its colonies was the same we met on the occasion of his marriage to Queen Mary I of England. We attended their wedding back in July 25th, 1554. And as we saw, they had a stillborn child in March of 1558. 6 months later, the former Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, Philip's father, died of malaria, complicated by gout, on the 21st of September, 1558, at the age of 58. His rooms at the monastery were decorated with paintings by Titian, the Venetian painter Titian, as well as clocks. He had clocks on every wall, paintings by Titian and clocks on every wall. He was found in bed holding the cross that his beloved wife Isabel had held on her death. So after a lifetime of fighting, he died peacefully in his sleep. The 42-year-old Queen Mary I of England died 2 months later at St. James Palace on November 17th, 1558. And she was succeeded by Elizabeth I, as we said. Paul. So Pope Paul died on August 18th, 1559. He was so despised, owing to the suffering caused by the war that his hatred for Spain had brought on the Papal State, that the people of Rome erupted into rioting. Crowds gathered at the Piazza del Campidoglio, and they began rioting even before Paul died. His statue, which had been put up in the Campidoglio, previously was already up, but his statue was placed on trial and convicted of numerous crimes, and it was sentenced to death, death by decapitation. So they carried out that sentence, and then they threw the remains in the Tiber River. The crowd then broke into the three jails of the city, freed more than 400 prisoners, then broke into the offices of the Inquisition. They murdered the inquisitor who was there, Tommaso Scodi. They freed 72 prisoners, one of them being Cardinal Moroni, who was still sitting in jail, unconvicted, after 4 years. The mob then ransacked the palace. They set it on fire, destroying the Inquisition's records. By the third day of the rioting, The crowds had removed the Carafa family coat of arms from all churches, monuments, and other buildings in the city. So he was erased. Paul IV was followed as Pope 224 by Pope Pius IV. So we will pause here, and we will pick up next time with the reign of Pius IV. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.